now. It's 11 o'clock, so let's get started.
Sure.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Cindy Hansen from My Outcomes, and we've got the esteemed David Prescott with us. And David is going to be talking about feedback-informed treatment, the use of PCOMs with people who have sexually abused. Welcome, David. David's presentation is going to take probably about 45 minutes, and he has graciously agreed to answer some questions. So if you have questions, just put them into the chat function. David can't see the questions if you put them in there, or the poll. So use that chat function, and we'll get to your questions at the end. Okay, David, I'm going to turn my camera off, go on mute, and just join everyone in listening to your presentation.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you. Okay, and I might actually turn off my camera for a little bit too, and then bring it back up again in just a bit. And so, well, welcome. And it's really nice to be here, and I really appreciate the kind introduction and invitation to be here from Cindy. So I've been in some of these webinars before, and am very aware that there's a very broad range of experience here. So I expect that most people will be a little less familiar with the treatment of people who have sexually abused, and it will have a diverse amount of experience in terms of the use of the ORS and the SRS. So I'm going to sort of aim for all audiences here. And I might also mention, and I'm just trying to see if I can get there we are, my contact information up here. Again, my name is David Prescott, and you can see my email address here. I like to joke that because I have an Earthlink account, that's a sort of clear evidence that I'm in my 50s. And I'm coming to you from my home in Portland, Maine, in the Portland, Maine area, and I'm from the Beckett family of services. I might also add, I understand from a colleague that a number of people will be joining us from Romania, and so that was very pleasant to hear. So if you're from Romania, bună seara, bine ați venit, and mulțumesc, it's great to have you here. So, all right. So I'll start here with anybody that's new to this field. This is an absolutely fascinating field that sometimes I believe is a little bit, when we first get into it, it's a little bit like encountering this northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota street gang here, that many of us originally got into the field in order to help out with public safety and work with people who've caused a great deal of harm to rebuild their life and so on and so forth. And then as we start to understand the problem of sexual offending, we have no choice but to come into a much wider knowledge of human sexuality and criminality. And all of a sudden, it's very much like encountering these bears, where from one day to the next, one doesn't always know exactly what's going to happen. We sort of all enter a weird and strange twilight world of sexuality. And so if you're new to the field, I hope that you'll stick around. And if you've been in the field for a while, I hope that you'll take good care of yourself as well. At my age, I've seen far too many people decide that this kind of work isn't for them. And yet at the same time, I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I don't believe that I've been bored since the mid-1980s. So virtually everything that I present today comes to us from some very, very bright and wonderful people who I really need to acknowledge. Obviously the work of Scott Miller, with whom I've recently published an article. You can find it at my website, which is davidprescott.net. Also the work of Mark Hubble, somebody I've never actually met, but who has contributed to the Heart and Soul of Change books, and the little bit of information I've been able to get about him seems like a very fascinating guy who enjoys something like cold water scuba diving or something like this off the coast of Maryland. A very interesting fellow. This man here is I can't pronounce his name very well, but Bogdan Jan from Bucharest, Romania, who is doing some absolutely fabulous work implementing feedback-informed treatment, PCOMs, around the country of Romania, and is incredibly dedicated to the work. Holds 2-day trainings on the weekend, and has really done amazing work at spreading the use of the instruments throughout that country. This is Bruce Wampold. If you've never read anything by him, you've certainly heard of his work with the common factors and so on. And if you ever get a chance, if you haven't, I highly recommend almost anything that he's written, including, of course, his book, The Great Psychotherapy Debate. Down here we have Nick Drury. Those of you who are on the Heroic Agencies listserv will know him and his contributions. Nick has done a marvelous job in recent years of turning a critical eye to our field and to place the broader work of psychotherapy into a much larger context. And I'll probably leave it at that for now. But if you're not on the Heroic Agencies listserv, you might want to do a Google search and find your way on there. Mike Lambert, of course, who's done some incredible research right up to as early as this week at a conference out in the Canadian prairies, has really advanced the field of collecting client feedback. This is Bob Bertolino, who does a lot of excellent work with adolescents, and of course Barry Duncan, who in my field has actually made quite a bit of contribution, speaking as a keynote speaker at the conference of my professional organization, the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. So I'm very grateful to all of these folks and just wanted to put a face to the name. And from here, let's talk a little bit about how this work even came to be. This is just a picture from the 1960s and the women's movement from that time. Some really fascinating things happened back in those days, really important activities, and really arguably it was the women's movement that finally put the problem of sexual abuse onto the world stage of dialogue. I like to joke that sometimes I think I can see my mother someplace in this picture. But it was the first time when we had a national dialogue saying that sexual abuse was causing harm to especially to women and children, and that this kind of behavior was unacceptable. Obviously, this is a national dialogue that has continued to this day with all of the discussions most recently about alleged assaults on various college campuses. Some of these reports apparently more credible than others. But it really was one of the first times when people said, okay, we really need to do something about this, and perhaps we can use some forms of counseling to help people build better lives as well as safer communities. And then, of course, as we all know from human nature, that since the dawn of time, whenever people have experienced pain or suffering, they've gotten together to talk about the things that have bothered them. And my field has certainly been no exception. This is a picture of one of the very first conferences of the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. It was part of a National Institute for Mental Health grant. And at the time that this photograph was taken in the early to mid 80s, this was basically all the experts in North America getting together around these tables to talk about what could we do to promote responsible assessment and treatment of people who have sexually abused. I'm also fond of saying you might recognize a strange piece of equipment. This is an ancient form of technology next to the fellow that's standing. It's called an overhead projector. Some of us might actually be old enough to remember this as a training tool. Okay, just maybe a little bit of humor for an otherwise challenging subject. And so from here, what these researchers did was come together and try to figure out how do we understand the problem of sex offending. And following the principle of when in doubt, chunk it out, they came to the conclusion that, well, you know, some people have a purely sexual motivation for sexual crimes. In other words, there can be a sex piece to a sex offense and an offense piece to a sex offense. In other words, not all sex crimes are actually sexually motivated. Some people abuse because of an intrinsic sexual gratification that comes from, for example, molesting children or the suffering and humiliation of the people that they've abused. And as you see in the picture on the right, sometimes, quite frankly, people just get mean. They might be facilitated by alcohol or various kinds of situational factors. But there's many motivations for sexual offending, and therefore many possible treatment targets. And I think that this point is very important to make because it is not the case that all people who molest children, for example, are actually pedophiles. Pedophilic disorder being an actual categorizable mental illness found in the DSM. And in some cases, we're simply looking at crimes. And so out of having no research at all, some of the first studies came forward saying, maybe there is a way that we could actually provide treatment to these people. However, questions persisted around to what extent can people actually change their sexual interests. We know that people can change their behaviors, but can they change their interests? And these are questions that persist to the present day. This fellow came along, Robert Martinson, in 1974, and he wrote an extremely influential article. I was telling Cindy Hansen just before we started that I'd recently done some training in Poland, and one of the speakers that I heard speaking in Polish had actually referred to this study. This fellow, Robert Martinson, obtained a worldwide reach with this article in which he asks, does nothing work? And this became known as the nothing works doctrine. In 1974, he did some preliminary analyses and found that people who get into trouble with the law didn't seem to benefit very much from psychotherapy. By the very next year, well, first I should say, he became a very famous man as a result of this article and hit the talk show circuit, and he was on 60 Minutes, and there's an interview with him in People magazine that you can still find on the internet. As soon as 1 year later, in 1975, the final analyses were beginning to prove him wrong. He started to acknowledge this in 1976. In 1979, he wrote an article that basically conceded that he had been wrong all along, and that article, of course, received almost no media attention whatsoever. And he passed away tragically in the early months of 1980. I mention him because many of us have developed a kind of therapeutic pessimism, maybe even a therapeutic nihilism, believing that people who've done really egregiously bad things are unable to change, when in fact all of the research is beginning to show that this is actually not true. But by the time the 1980s came around, the common belief was that so-called sex offenders are destined to a lifetime of destruction and havoc. There were very serious questions about whether or not these people could change, and as a result, I think it's basic human nature that when we hear about a terrible sex crime, that most human beings will recoil in some degree of horror and want to obliterate not only the sex crime, but to some degree the sex offender himself. And as a result, some of the earliest writings in our field concluded that treatment should be a harsh and confrontational experience. And further research has proven that that is actually not the case, that harsh confrontational treatments actually can not only not produce a good outcome, but can also make matters worse. It's easy for us all to forget that any problem that we can make better in therapy, we can also make worse, and hence the need for a more individualized treatment approach. By the time the 1990s came around, it was common to hear phrases like, "there is no cure for sex offending." In fact, this phrase has actually been written into the laws of many states. The western state of Colorado actually had to engage in legislation to remove this language after many people in our field came to realize that it wasn't really the right question to ask. The question is not, is there a so-called cure for sex offending, but rather, what are the active ingredients in any kind of treatment that are going to get people to manage their behavior throughout the rest of their lives? Now, obviously, this is a discussion that could take place over the course of many days, and in fact, it does take place over the course of many days, but I'm just hopefully giving you the news you can use as I set up the rest of the webinar. The sum and substance of it is that ultimately the safest sex offender is somebody who is stable, behaviorally stable, who's occupied with either a job or education, who has supportive people in his or her life to whom he's accountable, has some kind of plan for the future, and ultimately has everything to lose by repeating his or her past behavior. So this is where we're at up to the present. Studies back in the day in the late 1980s found that our first attempt to provide treatment didn't seem to be all that successful, and the problem was that our research methods weren't particularly good. By the time the early 2000s came around, we started to realize that, in fact, there were some aspects of our treatment programs that were working. And that, in fact, after about a 5-year follow-up, only about 17% of untreated sex offenders actually seemed to be reoffending. And that 10% of those who completed treatment programs were known to reoffend. This is roughly equivalent to about a 40% reduction. And I think that this is really something to be proud of for the folks working in our field. The more recent studies have found that the most effective programs seem to adhere to specific principles, which I'll define in just one second. But I just want to take a look at this and mention some very recent research that really should give us cause for hope and optimism. And that's this fact that only 1 out of every 5 people who sexually abuse is actually known to go on to do it again. An early criticism of this study was that it only included a follow-up average of something like 5 years. More recent studies have actually found that that when sexual reoffense does happen, it seems to take place within the first 5 years of freedom in the community. In other words, it is not the case that once a sex offender, always a sex offender, as many of us have been brought up to believe. We've all thought, many of us have bought into the mythology that there's a small handful of extremely dangerous people out there that persist in crime no matter what, when in fact there's actually a very great deal of sexual abuse taking place in our communities. But by far the most typical sex offender is actually only going to come to the attention of the legal system once throughout his career. And so this should provide us with a little bit of hope and optimism. There's an obvious criticism that this is based on official records, and we don't know what happens behind closed doors, that sexual abuse is a crime that thrives on secrecy, and so on. And yet, on the other hand, as many people note, there's a couple of things. The first is that once a person has been arrested for a sex crime, there will be a whole lot more eyes looking at him than there were prior to that. And therefore he has good reasons not to do it again. And the second is that the rates of non-sexual reoffense are actually quite a bit higher indeed, leading some people to believe that our clients actually aren't as well experienced and expert at getting away with things, quite frankly. So, in the most sophisticated study ever done in California, the Sex Offender Treatment and Evaluation Project, or SOTEP, although they found no overall differences between the treated and untreated groups, they did find that sex offenders who successfully completed their treatment goals really did reoffend at lower rates. In other words, in the view of their therapists, these were the fellows that got it. And this, in my view, is what we need to cultivate within our treatment programs. The real question becomes then, how do we get our clients to really meaningfully participate in treatment? How do we make their treatment goals relevant to them? And I think you probably see where this is going. I believe that the use of the ORS and the SRS can be critical to building up these people that so-called, in quotes, get it. So, what we find is that the most effective treatment programs seem to adhere to some basic principles. One is called the risk principle. The other is called the need principle. And finally, there is the responsivity principle. And I'm just going to explore these for a few minutes before I get into some specific use of the measures themselves. The first is the risk principle, and this essentially holds that the most effective programs are going to match the level of treatment intensity to the level of risk posed by the client. In other words, the more the risk, the more intensive the treatment experience should be. I believe I'm speaking to the choir when I say that most psychotherapy these days does not last as long as it should. Whereas psychotherapy had a reputation back in the 70s for taking forever. The reverse is now true. Most therapy does not last long enough to do the job, but clearly not everybody is equally dangerous and not everybody needs the same dosage of treatment. In fact, research has begun to show that mismatches in treatment dosage can actually result in increased risk. That criminal history is predictive, that very often we look at the horrible details of a sex crime and forget that actually some of the most predictive aspects of a given offender in an assessment situation, some of the least interesting factors are actually the most predictive of whether or not they will do it again. For example, when assessing juveniles who have sexually abused, very often the nature of their sexual interests is actually less important than the simple question of whether they've done it before, gotten caught, and gone on to do it again. I can take any questions that people might have about that a little bit later on. When we consider the risk principle, however, this is something where we need to put our own personal beliefs and values and attitudes and morals off to one side. We need to forget our values. We need to forget everything else and think about risk as an underlying likelihood that one is going to do it again. One of the real practice skills of working in my field is separating out the offense from the person who's actually caused harm. That although I cannot I cannot accept sexual abuse in my community, I still need to be able to accept the person who's in front of me and showing up for treatment. Put another way, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a man, I'm a neighbor, and I'm a citizen. And I get driven to the very edge of distraction by sexual abuse as much as anybody else. But when I go to work, I have to be able to work with the person who's in front of me. Because if I don't do my job the right way, I can make people more dangerous as well as less. The need principle basically says that effective programs target what we know as criminogenic needs. And essentially this means we need to turn to research to find out what kinds of treatment needs are going to be relevant for which kinds of people. And so it may be that what is valuable and meaningful to somebody in their life may not necessarily be the same thing that turns up in a comprehensive evaluation by a forensic psychologist. Part of our job is to do a kind of choreography, a real dance between what research shows and what our client is presenting to us with. And after all, that is the nature of evidence-based practice, that we're using our clinical expertise and the individual characteristics of our clients alongside what the research shows is relevant to their treatment. So people who have sexually or violently abused require specific treatment programming, and that other kinds of programming can result in ancillary gain, but it's not necessarily the case that their risk for reoffense will be reduced. This leads us to some important questions about what are we trying to accomplish in treatment. Are we trying to reduce risk? Are we trying to prevent reoffense? Are we trying to provide assistance to people who've been abused? Or are we trying to help our client build a better life and manage risk factors? Are we trying to build on internal capacity, or are we trying to do something else? And these are questions that we all need to ask ourselves. And so just examples of typical treatment goals might be criminally oriented interests, attitudes and beliefs, ways of looking at the world, otherwise known as cognitive schemas. Do they have criminal associates or people who somehow make it easier for them to cause harm to others in their lives? Self-regulation, self-management sometimes. This can take the form of problem-solving skills or coping skills. So these are things that I find myself typically trying to target in treatment alongside what is meaningful to the client. Finally, and very importantly for purposes of our discussion, is the responsivity principle that basically holds that effective programs are going to be those that are responsive to client characteristics. This can include all manners of different things, from motivation and maturity and cognitive abilities, even the mode of intervention and scheduling concerns, as well as things like the neurological impact of trauma and adversity. Simply put, when I consult the programs, I always encourage them, spend 80% of your efforts trying to adhere to these three basic principles as you develop your program. And once your program is fully developed, spend 80% of your efforts trying to build your client's responsivity. We want treatment to be meaningful and relevant to our clients, and that's really where the measures come in. This fellow in 2005, recently retired, Bill Marshall, did a great deal of research on effective therapists within the field of treating people who had sexually abused. He found that the most effective treatment providers are warm, empathic, rewarding, and directive. And I mean that word in the sense of guiding. Unfortunately, as many of you know, many people think that they have these qualities but don't necessarily actually demonstrate them. I recently asked an audience of 200 corrections officers how many of them thought that they could benefit from becoming a warmer and more empathic person, and not one person in the room raised their hand. I've had other treatment experiences where a great deal, many more people said, well, of course, couldn't we all stand to become a little bit more warm and empathic as human beings? However, I think the research from Stephen Walfish and his colleagues really puts this into some sharp relief. When he surveyed therapists around all 50 of the United States, he found that there were no differences in how clinicians rated their overall skill level and effectiveness level between disciplines. However, and I trust that some of you have heard this before, the average clinician rated themselves as being at the 80th percentile of effectiveness compared to their colleagues. In other words, the average clinician appears to rate themselves as though they're already pretty good. And less than 4% of clinicians considered themselves to be average. No one rated themselves below average, and only 8% of clinicians rated themselves as lower than the 75th percentile. 25% rated their performance at the 90th percentile or higher compared to their peers. So this, for people who work with individuals who have sexually abused, is a very potent threat to public safety and to the well-being of our clients. If we take these findings and cast them against the historical tendency of sex offender treatment programs to be harsh and confrontational in their approach, it has been too easy for too long for therapists to view treatment as a kind of privilege and not a right for our clients, and to treat their clients as though if the clients don't do exactly what the therapist says, that the therapist will kick this person out of treatment. And in fact, this sort of a harsh confrontational approach did go on for many, many years until a 1998 meta-analysis actually found that people who were adversely terminated from our treatment programs actually became higher risk than they did when they first came through the door of treatment. Let me say that again. When people are adversely terminated from treatment programs, they can actually become more dangerous independent of all other factors. This simple fact alone should cause people in my field to become very, very humble. And I'm proud to say that within our field, I do believe that people have become a little bit more humble. The problem is that we're not studying ourselves. We're not looking in the mirror to find out just how effective we actually are. And so I'm very grateful to Daryl Chow, who's done some really fascinating research, and in fact, I've even stolen this picture directly from one of his presentations. He argued at the ACE conference in 2013 in Amsterdam that amongst the most effective therapists who use the measures, the ORS and the SRS, he's argued that these characteristics of openness and being surprised when we get negative feedback actually seem to tease out some of the best therapists from the rest of the therapists. And so I encourage people in my field to always go about their work not only with an attitude of humbleness, but of real genuine openness to feedback, and to even be a little bit surprised when they get negative feedback, because hopefully it will motivate folks in my field to work just a little bit harder. I can say more about that later if anybody likes. Meanwhile, I just want to welcome you to the work that I do. So I'm an administrator, manager, supervisor, as well as a clinician. I'm one of those who insists on keeping a small caseload so that I can keep my fingernails dirty with actual treatment. But I respond to a board of directors. And I need to be able to defend the actions of the people that I supervise, as well as the programs that they're in. This is a chart that I developed from a report to a board of directors, and in it, my concern was we know that some people simply age out of bad behavior. The juveniles, the young people in our residential programs very often simply mature their way out of bad behavior. And I want to know, and I want to be able to demonstrate to a board of directors that what we're doing is actually responsible for any positive outcomes that we have. And I also want to be able to demonstrate that we actually are producing some good outcomes. So I consistently monitor the amount of physical management. I use risk assessment instruments and measures of treatment needs and treatment progress. You see something there called the TNPS. That is the treatment needs and progress scale. I measure how well we're doing at getting families involved in treatment, and I also measure client change on the outcome rating scale and the session rating scale to find out, is what we're doing actually resulting in treatment progress? Is what we're doing actually working? I'll jump ahead. As I've found in using the outcome rating scale and the session rating scale, there's some sort of good news and bad news situations. The good news is that in our treatment programs, we've managed to make remarkable gains in how much family work we're actually doing. And yet, if I track our progress using the outcome rating scale, some of the feedback that we've gotten and some of the indications that I've seen is that our adolescents score all over the map on the ORS. And that through the feedback we're getting, we're finding that the kids in our programs are really perceiving themselves as well out of control of their own lives, and that they desperately want their families even more involved in treatment than they already are. So without the use of this measure, I would have told you a year ago or 2 years ago that we were doing a great job at getting families involved in treatment. But what we're really hearing from the kids that we work with is that they need even more family involvement than they already get. Okay, and so many of you, I believe, are already very well acquainted with the outcome rating scale, but here it is. I'm very interested in finding out where our clients are at overall from one session to the next, individually, interpersonally, and socially. And of course, this is the session rating scale that basically builds on the work of Edward Borden from 1979, who did some of the first defining, I guess, of the therapeutic alliance. And of course, as many of you know, over 1,100 studies have already pointed to the importance of the therapeutic working alliance in producing change. In the old days, we used to say that people who sexually abuse are somehow different from the rest of humanity, and that they needed treatment that was either harsh or confrontational, psychoeducational, and the like. And our data is really beginning to suggest otherwise, and that the clients that wind up making the most amount of treatment gains are the ones who also are showing the most reliable change on the ORS, and whose therapists are genuinely interested in their feedback on the SRS. Okay, so as many of you will be familiar, this is a sort of basic graph for the ORS and SRS. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip over this. You can certainly download these measures if you haven't already from websites such as the Heart and Soul of Change, heartandsoulofchange.com, scottdmiller.com, centerforclinicalexcellence.com. There's many ways to gain access to these measures and to get some good online webinar training in their use, at least to get you started. Let me introduce you, though, to a couple of cases. This is Arturo. He came to me when he was about 22 years old. I've sanitized the case just a little bit, but he had sexually abused 2 children 3 years previous, and comprehensive assessment actually showed him to be quite low risk and quite amenable to treatment. The other people in his life had as a goal for him a basic goal of no more victims. The problem that I have with the goal of no more victims is, well, first of all, nobody's going to disagree with the goal of no more victims, but my concern was that it might not be broad enough, and that I wanted to build a lifestyle for him, or help him build a life in which no more victims was a given, and that anything like a sex crime would be so undesirable and so unnecessary to him that he wasn't even thinking about victimization at all, but was really just going about his business. Of course, he was a younger fellow, and his goal was simply to get other people off his back to the best of his abilities. And as far as I was concerned, he was a very immature man, and I was always remembering what Jay Haley once said about treating adolescents, that one of the main problems for treating immature people is that they're in treatment at all. So I realized that he didn't want to be there, and that he would rather go about changing his life on his own. So when I first did the ORS with him, he scored at about 31, and this put him into a category that is at risk for dropout and correlates with people who aren't interested in being mental health treatment. As I got to talk about his situational factors in his life throughout his first session, we got about 35 minutes into the session, and I asked him if he would like to reconsider his initial scores, and his ORS went down about 10 points at that point. We talked a lot about how he was mostly angry about having to be in treatment at all, and that really what he wanted out of treatment was to demonstrate that he was no longer the person that he had been 3 years earlier. And so I didn't quite make the cutoff on the SRS, but at least I had him talking to me. And so over time, both the ORS and the SRS improved. This is what they looked like. I started at 35, and gradually his scores improved over the course of time. Now, I want to just say right here that three of the things that I find in working with people who've sexually abused are particularly important, sort of as tips and traps for people who enter our field. And the first is that Arturo, like most other people in trouble with the law, has a difficult time with cognitive flexibility. In other words, people who are listening to this webinar have probably already just started to think a little bit differently about this clientele. Arturo couldn't do that. It was very difficult for him to change the way he thought, and a lot of this was probably secondary to the really incredible amount of trauma and childhood adversity that he had experienced. Arturo looked at the world in very specific ways. He really believed the world was a dangerous and harsh place as a result of his bad experiences. And the third the trap that I could have fallen into was his distrust of authority. If there's anything that I've found in working with people who break the law and sexually abuse, it's that they can be profoundly distrustful of authority. And this is one of the things that makes the SRS even more important in my view, that empathic and truly attuned interventions with people who break the law are always going to be impactful. They will always be unexpected, and they will always be welcome. And that by using the SRS and the ORS in each session, I could truly separate myself from the rest of the people who Arturo and others have I could separate myself from the pack of otherwise authoritative and harsh confrontational people in their lives. So with Arturo, what I did is I reviewed the goal of wanting to demonstrate to others that he was no longer the same person. I actively reviewed this goal before each session and interspersed it throughout our conversations in order to keep it alive and to keep it real and ensure that it just wasn't something on a piece of paper. He was eventually able to discuss what he had done because as far as he was concerned, he had a brand new identity, and that sex offending was something that he had had to go through in his life to become the more wise and decent person that he was today. He had a plan for preventing sexual aggression and for even preventing allegations of further abuse. So Arturo was a genuine success story. Eric came to me when he was 12 years old. He had a severe history of trauma and physical aggression. He had really just been battered from pillar to post by his birth father. It was the kind of violence that always leaves me amazed that somebody had been able to that had been able to survive. He had also gone on to sexually assault some children at church, as well as becoming physically aggressive towards them as well. I explained my limits on confidentiality. His initial ORS score was way up at about 38, as was his SRS. The closest that I could get to any kind of feedback was when he said that I could do better if I would take him out to McDonald's, please, for a hamburger, or at the very least bring in popcorn. And although I am not averse to bringing in snacks when I'm doing treatment with kids, this was the best kind of feedback that I could get. He didn't want to discuss his scores, but he would describe his various situations at home, in the school and community. Massive disparity with scores. Frankly, I was not touching it with Eric. And so he remained at very great risk for dropout. One of the concerns that I have in working with people who break the law is that even if when they're mandated into treatment and showing up, they may be at risk for, well, let me say it differently. While other clients might be at risk for dropping out of treatment and do drop out of treatment, my clients very often can't drop out of treatment because of their involvement with the legal system. And I consider them to be at risk for a kind of psychological dropout for treatment. And what happened is that I was better able to pick up trouble earlier than I might have. I knew that he was in trouble. And one day, what actually happened is he came in threatening to beat up and seriously injure his 5-year-old sister. Most clinicians that I know tend to be overachievers and would have been the kind of clinicians to say, if I work with Eric a little bit more, he'll be less likely to actually beat up his sister. Thanks to the use of these measures, I knew he was at risk for psychological dropout. And we continued on for several sessions, still no dialogue on the feedback measures. I made a mistake one day when I talked to his adoptive father. This was a kid who wanted to only be able to talk to me. I did have an action plan of emphasizing that I was his therapist and not his adoptive father's, and I emphasized a calm and soothing approach. And this worked, but only to the point where he started to describe this homicidal intent with no safety plan in place. Out of concern for younger people, and because of how poorly I felt I was doing on the measures, I called for a team meeting and said very quickly, I am not the right person for this job, and that I have to say my safety concerns for his younger siblings were far too overarching. And so you can hear my phone ringing in the background. I'm just going to ignore that for a second and bring this to a close. I apologize for the interruption. Anyhow, so that's what you get when you work at home, I'm afraid. So to put this into some context then, I knew I wasn't doing a great job. I managed to breach his trust by talking to his father in front of him, or his adoptive father. He then started talking about wanting to seriously injure his sister. Many clinicians would be tempted to try to save the day. Instead, I went straight to team meeting, explained that I wasn't the right guy for the job. And I believe that the moral of the story, I believe that his younger sister actually wound up escaping a severe assault thanks to my efforts, because despite the fact that I had a duty to warn and my ethical codes left me with no choice, I believe that I was the wrong therapist for the job. I was not a good therapist for Eric, but I did did accurately predict that things could get much worse. So I believe that although I was not a good therapist in that situation, I was a good clinician in that situation, and called a team meeting. The others who were waiting patiently for him to get better and become safer would have waited a long time at great expense. I've used this case example on a number of occasions, and I'm happy to say that in real life, he wound up in a residential placement for 18 months, and when he got out, people wanted a new assessment. They sent him to me, and he came to tell me that, in fact, things had turned out very well for him, and that he was very grateful for my efforts, which I have to say surprised me a very great deal, because I, in truth, beat myself up pretty badly as a result of not doing a better job. So this is just an example for those of you that might be less familiar with the measures. This would be what you would want to see. The business world already knows what many therapists don't, which is that if you can elicit or solicit a negative feedback from your clients, and you can do something to make yourself a more responsive clinician or a more responsive business, you've got a customer for life. So organizations that implement the Partners for Change outcome management system have seen benefits such as dropout rates reduced by 50%, the effectiveness of therapy increasing by, in some cases, by as much as 65%. And in my programs, I have to tell you, complaints about the staff have reduced to almost nothing. Our programs have changed dramatically in this way since we started to implement these measures. And so I believe I'm going to leave it at that and see if there are any questions that anybody would like to ask. As you can tell, I love to talk about this stuff, and I'm happy to field any questions in the time that we have remaining. And Cindy, I wonder if you can hear me.
I'm here, David.
All right.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, and so I'm yeah. Let's get that camera back on. So I'm looking here, and come on, if anyone has any questions, we are available. And so far, no one has
Okay.
put any questions in, David.
Which is really good or really bad, but I'm going to use this.
Well, I think, it's kind of good because we are coming around to the hour. But if anyone does have anything, any burning questions, they can certainly ask them now. And if not, if something comes to them, they've got your email address.
Sure.
Right, we're going to be sending everybody a copy of this.
And I might just also add one small piece that I've been consulting with on some other folks too, which is when I'm not using the measures, I'm also a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers. I love doing motivational interviewing. And I had a young man come to me for treatment, and his initial feedback after the first session is, listen, I require a really harsh style. If you don't boss me around and tell me exactly what to do, I'll probably lie to you. And I'm trying to be honest with you about this, but basically the sub-message or the meta message was, don't use motivational interviewing because it won't work with me. And I really need discipline. And as a result, I became a therapist. I acted in a way that I don't usually do. And what do you know? It paid off in my SRS scores. Now that we know each other a little bit better, I can use a style that's a little bit more uniquely my own.
Right. But that's a great example of adjusting based on the feedback of the client.
Yes, right? Exactly. So.
Great, David. Thank you so much.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, Cindy. Thanks everybody for sticking around to the end.